Without much further ado, we'll hand over to George English from Kilmarnock Rotary, who's going to talk to us tonight about family history and surnames. So I'm quite sure we're all looking forward to hearing what George has got to say.
Okay, so delighted to be back because yes, I've been before. Anyway, family history, it's about us, it's about our parents, our grandparents, and going back in time and what happened and what they did. And so what I tend to do in these talks is talk a bit generally about family history. I've found by doing these a lot, surnames is a topic of interest. So I've asked for your Bill to send me your surnames, and we'll talk a bit about that. Talk a bit about the sort of background, because basically our ancestors lived through history, and that may have affected what they did. And say examples, what I try and do is pick relevant examples. So I've got some West of Scotland ones. I've got some broader ones, which the American ones we may not talk about. And I like the expression walking in your ancestors' footsteps, actually going where your ancestors lived, particularly if the houses are still there and so on. It really can bring to mind. Happy to take questions any time. Typically with Zoom, it's easier at the end perhaps, but feel free if you have a burning question to do that. So, family history's got a lot more interest in the last few years. Two big reasons. The internet, the accessibility of information now is so much better. In the old days, you had to go to the archives in the place where your ancestor lived. Now I can research around the world. And there are various things, obviously, on television. There's who do you think you are? And there are talks and so on and so forth. So, start with surnames, and what's interesting about surnames, they evolved. There was no formal system here, let's do it this way. And the first surnames were probably 1200, almost 1,000 years ago. And we've always called each other names. And so people tended to get called something that was different about them. So if you look at an imaginary ancient village, you had the lord of the manor, it might have been Stuart or some name like that. And in fact, the nobility were probably the first to get surnames of various type. You look at this map, this plan, wood, hill, just common things in a village or a town, field, hedge, meadow, all of those became surnames. And it could literally be the person living by the wood was known as Wood. Then surnames came along and that became a formal thing. And the place thing was quite a strong thing. Someone very often would move from a village just 4 or 5 miles away and come there. And of course, that was what distinguished them. The same name English or Fleming. We didn't get called that in England. We were in Ireland. In England, obviously, everyone had that name. So there are place surnames connected with the place. There are surnames of relationship. And you would get someone, Robert or Donald, the son would be called Robertson or Donaldson. Or, of course, in Scotland, it's Mac. And it's interesting, in each of the England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, there's a slight difference. So Donald's son in England, MacDonald in Scotland and in Ireland to an extent. In Wales, they tend to take the possessive. So instead of John's son, it becomes Jones and Williams. And they've got a lot more of that type. Hence, we find a lot more people like that you'll have some awareness of. Then another group was occupations. The smith. It's natural to call the smith or the tailor by what they do. And Smith is the most common surname. Every village had a smith, whether it's a blacksmith or something else. And so that was another source. And I bet you could think of a few more if I asked you now. And then nicknames. Literally, this person was short or strong. And again, that became the name that they were called. So there are 4 main types of surname. As I say, they evolved after William the Conqueror and times, etc. So local surnames, and we've mentioned some already. The Latin name, or if you like, is toponymic, but to do with places. So it's a relationship. And there are examples that I've used, MacDonald. It's plural in Wales. Occupations, there's half a dozen there. I'm sure you could add to those as we go on. And then nicknames, Brown Short, Crookshank. Do you know what that means? Crooked leg. Campbell, twisted lip. So, a physical feature of the person. Quite important, this bottom thing, you can visualize now, these can be adopted by anyone. Don't assume because someone's got the same surname as you that they are a blood relation. Obviously, in many cases they are, but don't assume that. So I asked Bill to send me your surnames. So put those up there. I hope that's helpful. There we have Robert's son, Fleming. In fact, I've just added on a couple of things here. Drennan, there, I've just had a quick look up. I don't know if you knew this, but it was recorded in Galloway and in the south of Ayrshire. The thing I looked up said it came from the Irish for blackthorn. You know, and Crone, I had again quick look up that's from Crochan, which suggests an Irish origin. It's not a precise science, this, but gives you an idea of where they may have come from. And with the Fleming surname, I thought it might not be yours, but I've been involved in a big project, Scotland and the Flemish people, coming out of St Andrews. But over the centuries, lots of people have come from Fleming. Textiles was a big factor. The surname Fleming is people from the Flemish or Flanders. And this whole project was very interesting, the whole range of good academics and so on, looking at the settlement in Scotland. Quite a few other surnames had Flemish origins and the various links and so on and so forth. And if there is a book about this, if it's of interest. Okay, so back to history. Our ancestors lived through history. So what are the big events that have happened in recent times? And the big one is the Industrial Revolution. Sort of got going in the 18th century and gained momentum. And typically that meant a lot of people who used to live in the rural areas, the country, work on farms, these sort of things, moved to the towns and cities where the new jobs were, iron, steel, shipbuilding. We could go on and on and on. And it was amazing, Britain's influence on the Industrial Revolution. We'll touch on that in a moment, but had a big, big effect on lots of families. Big thing in Scotland was the Highland clearances. Imagine saying that sheep were more valuable than humans, and so lots of people left. And with the American Canadian and other connections, I frequently get people from there who say, I've got Scottish or English ancestors, but would I research them for them? And the British Empire. About the 1500s was when Columbus and Magellan and people went from Europe out to the world and discovered various places. The British Empire grew, and we know America and Australia and so on and so forth. So again, quite a few people left Britain and went to these places and therefore have ancestors from here. Big factor in Ireland, you probably know a bit about this. In the middle 1800s, a lot of people in Ireland had one foodstuff, the potato, and there were 6 years of potato famine. 1 million people died, and 1 million people emigrated, and a lot of them came to Scotland, particularly the west of Scotland. So quite often have people who have an Irish ancestor somewhere. So this may have affected your ancestors. Now, people, of course, ask me, what are the odds of success? And basically comes down to 3 things. Did your ancestor do something that caused someone to record it? Secondly, has it survived? And thirdly, can you find it? And there are 4 big factors that affect that. Status, and very often the nobility and landowners, royalty, obviously, that someone kept those records. Professions and trades and employees, they kept records for things. Passenger lists are something that's become available recently and can add a real dimension to someone traveling from one place to another. But even at the bottom of the pile, so to speak, the workhouse, they kept records. What records? Most important, of course, the birth, marriage, and death. And official registration of those started in Scotland in 1855 and started in England 18 years before. I'm told the main difference is that the church didn't want to give up their monopoly. But the good thing in Scotland, when they did start keeping records, there's more information on the Scottish records as there is in England. About the same time, the censuses started every 10 years, and it records the whole family. So you can say, that is the correct parents for this person. It records the ages of the people, where they were born, their occupations, and it's a very useful bit of information. Very often what you're trying to do is find a second piece of information that confirms the first one is correct or not. Before registration, it was the churches that kept records when they baptized someone or married them or buried them. And then there's all sorts of other information, of course, wills, gravestones, and so on and so forth. The names, Obviously, in fact, it's a rare name, is easier to track or be sure it's the right family than John Smith. So the first names and surnames in Scotland, there's quite a strong first name naming system that was used, where the eldest son got the same name as the father and various other things. But that's a big factor, obviously, in success in finding the right people. And continuity. People live in the same place, clearly easier to track than if they move around, although thanks to the internet and various other things, it's much easier now to track people moving from various places, and indeed if they migrate to other countries. So a key thing I just want to say here, what is the evidence for that? A very good question to ask of politicians, various others, but that's the key thing. Obviously, quite frequently I find people who've got information, is it true or isn't it? And you get some people who have deliberately made up royal descent or what have you, or quite often they genuinely meant the right thing, but they've been misled by all sorts of other things. So very key that you can get evidence that says, yes, that is true. So let's start locally. Here's a map of Glasgow in 1795. Obviously, you see the Clyde there. The main part of the city now is here. Quite interesting, there's Govan Parish, was mostly green fields at that time. Story of Glasgow, remarkable industrial revolution. And it's interesting, the Act of Union, the timing of that was excellent because it came just as the Industrial Revolution was starting. I'm told the Scots signed up very quickly, providing they got access to the English colonial markets in America and elsewhere. And there was an immediate economic boom. And we've heard of the tobacco lords, the shipbuilding. Greenock had more than 20 sugar factories and so on and so forth. We all know the the hero outside the Museum of Modern Art, and that was actually a tobacco lord's house, you probably know. And the Industrial Revolution happened and just exploded. The River Clyde was dredged, so from then on, ships could get up to Glasgow. Glasgow really almost led the world in shipbuilding. And this is remarkable. In 1850, the UK had more than 40% of the total world's trade. Amazing, of course, it's gone down a bit since then, but Glasgow, second city of empire, absolutely, it was one. And here's the population of Glasgow between 1700 and 1900, went up by more than 50 times. Amazing. Okay, so let's look at a family who lived in Glasgow. So you probably know Bridgeton and Tradeston. So here we are, John Wallace marries Elizabeth Barr, 1959. So go back in time, the Wallaces have actually come from Fife to Glasgow. The Barrs were in Glasgow at the time, just south of the river, Clyde. Going back with the Wallaces, so there we are, Fife. And the Thompsons they married into, they were in Glasgow, but had come from Lanark, 30, 40 miles outside Glasgow. On the Barr side, no, they've been in Glasgow for a while, trying to get going. And Ireland. So I mentioned Ireland earlier on. So the McComb family have come across from Ireland in the mid 1800s. So one of the things I do, I don't know if you use Google Earth, but I plot where the various places that the family lived are, and that's very helpful. It helps me in my research. But here we are south of the Clyde. We can see various places where the Barr and Wallace family lived, and also quite often they're living near another family that the boy meets the girl, etc., etc. They move, but not all that far. And so you can see very much on the south side of Glasgow for quite a while, more than a century and so on. And Bridgeton was one of the places they lived. So here we've got I use Ordnance Survey maps a lot from the 1900s. This is 1910. So they actually lived in Adelphi. There's the Clyde. They lived in Adelphi Street and Muslin Street. Muslin obviously named after the textiles that was going on there. And the Wallaces had moved from Fife to Adelphi Street beginning of the 1900s. And actually, Andrew continued as a loom tenter. Very often they changed the occupation when they came here. And the Thompsons lived in Muslin Street. So you can see 2 or 3 streets away, they ended up met and so on. And look at this, weaving factory, weaving factory, weaving factory, all sorts of industry, another weaving factory. So textiles very strong in that part of Glasgow. And if you go back to the tree, their ancestry. So there's Andrew Wallace, a power loom tenter. William Thompson doing something pretty similar, leather belt worker. And I mentioned James McCoon and the Irish connection. So just to say a bit more about the family in Ireland, because as I say, probably a third to half of people I have from the west of Scotland have got at least one Irish ancestor. So this dreadful potato blight, mass starvation, I just can't conceive of it going on, maybe in Africa or whatever these days. But a million people died, a million emigrated, a lot went to America as well and so on. But imagine just having one foodstuff. I mean, it's just unbelievable. There's other factors we won't go into here, but many came to Scotland, and we look at football, don't we? Celtic and Rangers, they both have a connection with a religious background. Anyway, enough of that. So I thought, interesting enough, Kiswick's a pretty strong ingredient of the E Club, and actually it's 2017 when I did a talk with Gail Savage, and I guess you may have been around there, the others, so you can let me know later on. Anyway, the reason I picked that was I've actually got a Kiswick example. And interestingly enough, this came out of New Zealand, and people in New Zealand called Graham said, we've got ancestors from Scotland, would I have a look? So their ancestor in New Zealand was Rhoda Graham. Andrew Graham had moved from Glasgow to go out to New Zealand, and he was born in Kiswickside, as was his dad, who was a farmer, as was his dad, who actually was a justice of the peace. And an example of one of the key documents, the census. So here we are, the Grahams in 1851. There they are at Kiswickside and East Kilbride. And what we've got here is Andrew Graham, who was the one who went out to New Zealand eventually. So they're all born in Kiswickside, etc. John Graham mentioned he's a JP. In fact, the family were farming as well. His son, very much, farming 80 acres. There's his wife. She's from Cathcart, not too far away. And there's the young family at this point in time. Servants, a lot more families had servants then. Very often for a woman, unfortunately, the best chance you got very often was to become a domestic servant and hope to meet a man. But there we go. Let's not get into that too deep. But very key document because, as I say, all the family are there, so you could see the connection, you could see the ages, you could see where they were born. Very often you could track them moving around because of where the kids were born and their occupations as well. So if you go back to the family, they actually were at Kiswickside for I think 7 generations in total. And so there's John Graham, rather a good nickname, Parsonett Jock. And he was the one in the Graham family who first acquired Kiswickside. And they had come from quite nearby, Limekilns. I don't know if these names ring any bells to you. Actually had introduced Ayrshire cattle into that area. And they'd married into other local families. Now, ironically, look, if we look at Kiswickside now, it's very near the Rural Museum there. And here's the aerial view of where it is now and the way it was in 1858. So there's Kiswickside as it is now, and not a lot of change there. And the house they actually live in is Kiswickside House. Now, ironically, a few weeks ago, Mrs. Davidson, who lives there now, got in touch to say she lived there for 20 years, would be very interested to find out more about the history of the house. And so before the Grahams, people were living there, and obviously the Grahams actually sold up, and the people that I don't know if you know I think it's Caroline Davidson. I think he's a surgeon of some sort, but it'd be interesting if you actually knew him better. I put that example in. And the New Zealanders said we actually had come over, I think about 15 years ago. They'd met the owners, been shown round, and there was an old stone wall dated 1610. So the house, or a house there, goes back at least 4 centuries. And that's a sort of example of a story that builds up around people and the past and the housing and so on. A very common starting point is, here is this photo of my parents or my grandparents getting married. And of course, at the wedding are the happy couple. And typically in this sort of photo, there's the father and mother of both bride and groom, and other family members who are the start of the family tree. So in this case, there's a John Taylor marrying Susan Gebby in Darwell in Ayrshire. So let's look at them. So here we have Milligan and Taylor, and these are back to Rotarians in Ayrshire. Going back on the Milligan. In fact, when I met them, they said, both of our families go back in Ayrshire for many generations. So sure enough, there's the Milligans in Ayrshire, and so the the Taylors. And there, yes, going back Milligan, all Ayrshire there. And with the Taylors, Cambuslang was someone from quite near Glasgow. Riddex I've left blank for the moment because that's the one that proves the case, so to speak. So we look a bit more detail at Taylor and Gebby. We've seen that and here we are, Annie, Pennsylvania. So all this local connection, Ayrshire, and there's someone from America. How did that happen? And, when I'm researching, I get that far and questions come up. Can you find answers to them? Anyway, going to the Taylor side, found that the Taylors had actually come from Edinburgh and clearly had moved from there. And in fact, they were from Orkneys originally, had come down to Edinburgh and then eventually come across to Ayrshire. Now, one of the things we have here, there's a death record. So I thought I'd show you this. So here we have James Johnson Taylor. He was a commissionaire, so his occupation is there, also on census records. He was a widower of, and very often, of course, by the time someone dies, people don't know about the past. So he was married before, and there's his wife, Agnes Laird, tells you when he died, where, how old, so he's 82, and there's his parents, very useful. All three birth, marriage, death records in Scotland have the parents. So it shows the connection. So there's James Taylor and mother Catherine Essen and the cause of death. So very useful information. And can come back to that. And I'm going to come back to the Irishing in just a moment. We've just had Robbie Burns. Then we went to any Burns suppers. I actually threw a toast to the lasses at the Burns supper last Sunday. Anyway, interesting case I had here. The Hunters, so they are in Kilmarnock. Her dad's from Darbolton in Ayrshire, outside Kilmarnock. He's an engine fitter. Going back in time, his dad's a joiner. Going back, Mr. Dick's a farmer. His wife is Mary Dick, are going to go up that line. So she's a farmer's wife in Darbolton. Her father was a joiner, and mum, Jean Richard, also from Darbolton. And then her dad was a publican in Darbolton. I wonder if any of you recognise this building. Well, it's the Bachelors Club in Darbolton where Robbie Burns went with his friends, and John Richard ran the Bachelors Club pub when Robbie Burns and his friends went there. And I can tell you the person was a very big beam on his face when he heard about that. So connection with recent events. Just while we're on that sort of theme, obviously in Scotland, a very strong factor is the clans. Clans, you'll know, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a blood descendant of the clan, because a lot of the function of the clan was to actually try and protect people in the area and so on. And so people would give their fealty or loyalty to the clan in return for protection and so on and so forth. And of course, clans, some of them particularly in specific areas, others go much, much wider than that, etc. But the clans themselves, by and large, keep fairly good records. So quite often one of the things I do with the clan is go and find out for the clan what information do you have, particularly further back in time. I'm pretty confident I can get back at least a couple of hundred years with most people, but going back 1500s and before that can be much more difficult. Anyway, I'm just mentioning some of these in passing. You can come back to them in the questions if you wish. So I want to go back to the Milligan and Taylor, and there's Annie Riddex from USA. Now, look at this in a bit more detail. So the census, 1901 census, had these various people in. So you can see Isabella's born at 80, so she's in the centre at age 16, and there are her parents. Now, they're born in Ayrshire, and she's born in Pennsylvania, America, but eventually comes back to Scotland. So there's the census. There's John, and he's a coal miner. And that's the clue. What actually happened, a number of Scots and other coal miners went across to America, to mining areas where they got paid much better. And they would go stay for a number of years, perhaps, and then come back. That's exactly what happened here. And there we are. There's the full census, and you can see, tells immediately, the three eldest children are born over in America, and then they come back to Dreghorn in Ayrshire. Now, I mentioned passenger lists earlier on. What was interesting about this was I actually found 5 passenger lists, 5 ships taking Dunlops to and from America. So there was John Dunlop in 1879 going across to America for the first time. He's going back in 1906, and you can see here how he fits in. John Dunlop, Isabella's his daughter, who marries William Riddex. They go back in 1907, or go in 1907, and Annie is born in 1907. So almost certainly Isabella was pregnant with Annie when they went over there. And then there's a couple of examples where Marion Dunlop is coming back, presumably to visit family, with 5 or 6 children. I don't know what the affairs were like then, but and there again is Irish connection. So again, some flavors for you. Now, I've put a couple of American connection things in. Now, what's quite interesting, this is people from Canada got in touch, from Toronto, and they had ancestors from both England and Scotland. And you'll see in a moment what just this week they have been back in touch, and I'll explain why. So the Slades, yes, they were over in Canada in the early 1900s. Jessie Fleming here, you can see she came from Dundee 100 years ago or something. The rest were over in Canada by that time. So we want to just come here. The Slades were from Bristol. They're from England down there, and there's a whole story there. The Flemings were from Letham and Dundee, that sort of area. On the Pearden side, there's an English connection right down in Devon, and he marries a Scot from Dumfries. And in fact, the Slades were in Bristol for quite a while, and the Flemings and nobles very much stayed in the Dundee, Forfarshire area. Now, the reason I got in touch, well, here, they actually came over. They said, look, we'd like to come over and see this. So I do this quite often, arrange a day's visit to family ancestry. So you probably know Dundee quite well, but the Law, it's a very prominent place, and this is the view from there, nice. So the first thing I did, took them up the top of the Law, and you could see the places we pointed out where their ancestors live, the River Tay and so on. What's Dundee known for? Jute. Actually, the Camperdown Mill was the largest jute factory in the world. Again, Industrial Revolution. And they had ancestors who worked at the Camperdown jute factory. Other things in the past was there was no welfare state and so on and so forth. So there was the poorhouse. Sadly, a lot of people, couldn't afford, ended up in the poorhouse being looked after. And, this was an old map of where the poorhouse was there. So different factors that are relevant to Dundee. But the particular reason I mention this is that I found graves where the family lived. Now, again, with poverty, the noble family had actually got a lair to bury the family, but there was no gravestone. And that happened quite often. People could afford a lair, but they couldn't even afford a gravestone. And in fact, this is the Balgate Cemetery. There's a big grassed area, which is just where the masses got buried. Anyway, the Slade family got into this and said, we're going to do something about this. And just this week, they have sent me an email because they have got a gravestone. And so there is the gravestone that they have done. And it's a lovely bit of stone. I think it's a great, and here is the family. Don't need to go into detail too much, but they're the top 4 people are people who are actually buried there. And what they've done is to include those who went to Canada and the connection there and so on and so forth. But it's lovely to actually see people care enough about their ancestors to do something like that. So let's move on, and just trying to sort of give a flavour. You may remember I did actually do a talk about the Mayflower to you some years ago. I had an ancestor on the Mayflower, and brief bit of history there, or big bit of history. The Reformation of the 16th century, 1500, virtually the whole of Europe was Catholic. 1517, Martin Luther nails up theses protesting about some of the Catholic practices. So the Protestant religion started, went different ways in different countries. Some stayed Catholic, some went Protestant. Queen Elizabeth came on, and the England very much went Protestant. And the people on the Mayflower were actually people who were Protestants, but they didn't agree with the Church of England the way they did it. So they decided to separate. They went across to Leiden in Holland for a dozen or so years, and then 1620 got on the Mayflower and went over to America. And 2020 was the 400th anniversary. So I developed a talk on that, and I've done lots and lots of them, etc. But I just put it up because, as it happened, my ancestors affected by that, but a lot of ancestors affected. And it's fascinating. I'm sure you've done this talking to Americans. The Mayflower is such a special event to them to hear. It was one ship with 100 people who disappeared, and we got on with life. Enough of that. But we'll throw in one of the things in America. The Plymouth is where they landed, and they have recreated the original Plymouth village of 1627, and they have actors playing the characters. So I have actually met my ancestor from the Mayflower, Richard Warren, and it was a bizarre experience because I had so many things to ask him, but he knew nothing after 1627. So he was a merchant. He actually went out on the Mayflower and left his wife and 5 young daughters behind, never knowing if he'd see them again. In fact, they went 3 years later, had another couple of sons, and the rest is history. And to throw in one other thing, not to boast as such, but of course, lots of Americans have done lots of research. So without any expertise from me, I've come across other people who found other descendants of Richard Warren who are quite well known. And so just put up one. So Henry Longfellow, Ernest Hemingway, Orson Welles, authors and films and so on and so forth, prominent people. American presidents, so Roosevelt as a president, Ulysses Grant. No way I think I'd have been able to find these researching myself, but they're very distant cousins, but they're there. Alan Shepard, the astronaut, Richard Gere. Unfair that he got the looks and I didn't, I think. Now, you may know the kids aren't very into this sort of stuff, but I have found one way to get mine interested. Taylor Swift, the singer, is something like an 8th cousin, and the youngsters have heard of Taylor Swift. Anyway, enough, other singers and so on. But again, a bit of interest and fun in this, but it may, the way your family goes, may be all sorts of directions. And as it happens, had Richard Warren on the Mayflower, the following year, Philip Delano, someone went across, and he was actually a Fleming. He was from Flanders, or his family were. And it's interesting that hadn't been much research on various things and so on. So, cut a long story short, I wrote a book, which is interesting in itself, and I won't go into the detail of this, but what I like to do is try and bring the story to life. You don't actually want hundreds of pages of detail. You want something that brings it to life. And so I wrote this, in fact, self-published, which was a separate episode I could talk a lot about. But anyway, just to sort of wind up, in fact, there's a Delano Society in America, so eventually persuaded them to come and do a tour of Europe to the various places where the family lived. So they came, and in fact, our ancestors fled from Flanders to Canterbury, and Canterbury Cathedral allowed the refugees to use the basement, the crypt of the cathedral, for worship. Got in touch with them, and they laid on a special service for the Delanos. Because the French Protestant Church, they still meet to this day. And it really was very emotional to sit in that church and have the service. And 440 years ago, one's ancestors had come over and done that. So again, quite a special thing. So I'm not here to sell anything, but if you are interested, do various reports, various things. I give Rotary members a discount and so on. And it's been good in Rotary because I said to the local council one time, how do I promote my family history service? And they said, we'll get you a digital consultant. And he said, George, you need to make videos and podcasts. So cut a long story short, on YouTube, there's all sorts of things. If you're particularly interested in areas like Glasgow or Edinburgh, west of Scotland, London, I've made various videos on that. People obviously say, what can I expect from researching my ancestors? So I did a thing with 3 couples when they talked about what they got out of this. Surnames I've mentioned. And recently I started making podcasts where I sit down with the people after research and say, what do you get out of it? And so on. And anyway, enough of that. So just to wind up, thanks very much for listening. Did you know in Rotary, there is the Fellowship of Rotarian Genealogists? almost all American, so I have been to late, but of course with Zoom, I can be a part of that and others can as well. So if you're interested at all, in fact, the next meeting is this Sunday. So thanks very much for listening. Very happy to take any questions that you have.
Does anybody have any questions for George?
George, very interesting. My wife Emma, she's very keen on family history and is a member of the Glasgow History Society.
All right.
And a fellow Rotarian, Donald McDougall, used to be in the Glasgow Club. He's now in the east of Scotland. Donald asked Emma some years ago, because he knew what he was doing, could she do his family history? Now, everyone likes to go into newspapers, everything else, and find things. As you mentioned, it's amazing how many families have been in the actual poorhouse. And she was going along one particular line. And it was just the weekend after the annual Glasgow Rotary curling competition for the Harry Henderson, the Harry Jack Trophy.
Mm-hmm.
And we were going over to Oban for a weekend, one of our anniversaries. And we met one of the chaps there from Edinburgh, starting away. He said, "Have you been into the bookshop?" I said, "No." So Emma went in, and here's this. She went in up to a stand, picked up one book, opened it, and said, "Oh my goodness, I've been going down the wrong road." And that book, but she bought the book because, as you know yourself, you can, the family, I don't know, Emma does, but when you're going down in the lines for the family history, you can go down the wrong line and get caught out. And it turned out Donald, in fact, was an ancestor of Rob Roy.
Uh-huh.
And she had 5 volumes completed, articles from newspapers, everything else, and absolutely amazing. I haven't got the patience, I'm afraid.
No.
But so, do you do things like that as well? Do you go into the actual public life of a people if you're asked to do it?
Absolutely. I mean, it depends, and it's interesting the way you say that because, yes, you easily have done that. I mean, the expression "brick wall" you would have heard.
Yes.
Either that, but yes, and I said it. I very often put it. I'm trying to find a second piece of information that confirms the first, because you get the same names and it easily happens. And then, very much I try and bring to life, and it depends how far back you go. And it's interesting, sort of what other sort of information. Newspapers are an obvious source where you can find stories and so on, but it is literally like putting flesh on the bones. You get the bare facts about the person. But it's so one thing I find quite interesting. Of course, people by and large know perhaps the last 100 years of their family. When they were growing up, they remember Uncle this and all the rest of it, and they very often have stories. And I find the facts on those sort of people, and it's a two-way process because they have stories that add that. And I've got one at the moment where the lady said, on Dad's side, there was very little contact really. Once a year, my mother got dressed up and they went and visited this woman who she thinks was a sister of the grandfather. I've had a look, and this person had a daughter and then got married 4 years later. And I've got a bit more information on it. And in fact, almost certainly the husband of the illegitimate child was the person she eventually married. But a few months later, there's a case where she takes, on the father and various things. But that's a classic. That's a story being added and an explanation. Now, of course, sometimes you never explain, but very often what I do with someone is I do a first phase. And then I say, do you want to carry on or not? And you can carry on for a long time if you want, or you can say no. And one little thing I think is it's good when you can share with family members. Don't share 100 pages, particularly kids, but get things. There's always interesting stories that you can put in that people can relate to.
Okay, I've just a bit of a story. Really, John's older brother, his middle name is Thompson, and when my niece, his daughter, was doing the family tree, they have discovered where Thompson came from, and it originated from one of Rabbie Burns's conquests. And this female is actually buried in a cemetery at Pollokshaws in Glasgow, and that's where John's family originated from. So it's quite interesting. However, my granddaughter was doing something at school the other week on Rabbie Burns, and of course, John then showed her this family tree, and it's about, I think he's like 7 times removed great grandfather. So Sophie was absolutely delighted with this and took it into school. But what I was going to ask you, George, I mean, that's obviously a connection with our family. But do you come across connections to Rabbie Burns quite a lot?
I do. I wouldn't say a lot.
No.
I mean, clearly he had a lot of children, and there are a lot.
That's why I was asking. Yeah.
You could say various things, couldn't you? Because to have had one illegitimate child is something, but to have had half a. In fact, I won't go into detail, but I had a chat with one of the guys who knows about the leather condoms at Burns's time. Because in fact, my toast to the lasses, I mentioned that possibly if he was around today, he would have had less illegitimate children, because I think contraception was a little bit more efficient. But it's fascinating you say, I mean, Thompson, the person I just mentioned, they have Thompson ancestors, and not an uncommon, but not a common name, but you have got definite connection there. Finally, with Waddle, I had someone, and there were Waddles who were involved in the building of the fourth road bridge, the fourth railway. And in fact, they had quite a place. And it's interesting because obviously the first thing you do when you see a similar name, you wonder if there's a connection and whether you could prove it or not. But maybe John is connected with that.
No idea. I've not certainly no idea. But anyway, Drew.
George, I do a wee bit of genealogy myself, certainly looking at the family history. There are obviously some people, ancestors have come from Ireland at some point or other, but it would appear that some of them are registered as being born in Greenock. There is one line that I follow quite a bit. It's McCracken, which was on I think my father's side through several generations. But most of them were born in Scotland. But other people that are on Ancestry, the system, link the McCrackens from the west of Scotland to certain people in Northern Ireland. I can't see the direct, as you say, you have to double check everything, cross the T's and dot the I's before you can accept that link as being correct. Lots of other people have taken that link and taken it, but I can't see the link, if you get my drift.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, feel free to drop me a few details. A couple of things I'll say. I used to work with Murray McCracken, who to share an office with him. But a couple of things. So regularly, there was particularly around 1850 when a lot of Irish came across. Of course, they came across since, and all. I don't know if you know roughly when they may have come from Ireland to Scotland. I mean, Greenock was very much there in the early years of the Industrial Revolution and so on, maybe after 1850. What's quite interesting, there were quite a lot of Scots went across to Ireland in the 1600s and before. There's various things like that. And obviously Mac is both in Scotland and Ireland, the son. So there are various things that have there. Ireland, there is a difficulty in Ireland because the census, you may know, in 1922 in the Troubles, the Irish census got more or less destroyed. And so there's not that document. There's various other things you can do, but it is typically more difficult. But the basic challenge is the same. You know, can you find the information? Difficult then, but certainly it's something. And I've now got quite a good judgment to sort of, is this worth pursuing? And typically with you, what I would do, I'd have an initial look, and then this is looking quite good or not. Funny enough, there was a thing called the Griffith valuation about 1860. For it doesn't matter what, but there was almost a census. And so there's quite, you know, when there's no other censuses that have survived, or very few, this document can be quite good. And at the same time, it doesn't have as much information. So I've got some at the moment where I've got 4 people with that name near Coleraine. I can't find any other information that tells me more. So it depends. You know, you have a look initially, and one may or may not find answers.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Anything they want to ask George? Bruce.
Hi, George. Thanks for that. Any advice on merchant navy records? My father-in-law, I think, joined up about 1926.
Right.
I've done a bit of research and I found his Royal Navy Reserve record when he was in the war from 39 to 45. He was master of some of the ocean salvage tugs. And I do believe, I actually proved this, but the rumour was he was sent up to Barra to take the politician off the rocks. But being from the Highlands, he was in no great rush. He got there because all the guys were on the boats taking the whiskey off. But I can't actually find anything from when he joined up in 26 to 39, and after he was discharged from the Royal Navy, went back into the Merchant Navy, and he eventually became a master of one of the ocean weather ships.
Yeah,
I just can't find anything through the normal sort of routes. You know, like in Kew, you go to something like the National Archives in Kew, seem to hold the
where there are certainly, very often you find them actually qualifying, you know, being initially starting. Then can you find them actually working on the ship over the years? And that depends. Kew has some quite good records, etc. Again, I'd say just like with Drew, you know, feel free to send me and have an initial look. I mean, funny enough, you know, some newspapers is interesting that, particularly with a slightly less common name, you know, if you find a newspaper article, and so often you find someone who, you know, if I find Facebook these days, I even find occasionally that. So you've got a core of things where, yes, it is a problem in that, but quite often you can find the qualification. Did he was in the Royal Naval Reserve beforehand, is that what you're saying?
No, I think he joined up in the Merchant Navy when he was probably 16, 1926-ish. And then when the war started, he was in the Royal Navy Reserve.
Yeah.
So I've actually managed to get the record, most of that, what ships he was on and what.
And you got that.
Can't find anything from 26 to 39, and then after 45 through to when he joined the ministry.
You know, was he in Scotland in 1939 or England? You know?
No, he was in Scotland. He was born in Stirlingshire, and he was in Scotland.
One of the annoying things was in 1939 they took what they called the 1939 Register. Someone said that war's coming, we better. And they released it in England and Wales about 4 or 5 years ago, and they haven't in Scotland. And it's such a useful document because census typically isn't released till 100 years out. So Scotland 1921 is the most recent one. Now, if he was in England, there's a good chance he would be there in the census, at least with merchant, whatever, you know, so the best thing. So it's certainly a more difficult thing probably, but so feel free to.
Okay.
I just find it fascinating to hear of the amount of avenues that you can go down to find out all this information. You know, it's fascinating. I know when my niece was doing, as I say, our sort of family tree, she said it could be quite time consuming as well, you know, because as you say, once you go in, then you have to go somewhere else, and it's quite a fascinating to be able to see it all on a bit of paper, you know, bits and sheets of paper. Anyway, anybody else, anything else that want to ask
on that? I mean, again, some of the defined family history is every question you answer just poses another question.
Yeah.
But it becomes more interesting the more you know, the more you see. And again, Jigsaw's an analogy I use that as you find some pieces that, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating the amount of information, as you say, you can gather from it, and that was really Lindsay just really went down the Waddle side of the family, you know, and when you think about when it starts to get this generation and then you know the kids, and it's fascinating to see it
You,
all.
you need to
All
decide
written.
whether you're going to be disciplined or not. So, as you say, very easy to lots of
Yeah.
side issues.
Can I ask Laura to do the vote of thanks on behalf of the club, please?
Can I just thank you, George? It's really interesting when you hear names of places and names that you realise that when you're kind of talking and you think, oh, I've been there, or like Adelphi Street is where my mother-in-law came from, I think.
Right.
So they were in Bridgeton, and when you were talking about the Clyde getting dredged, I always remember my granny. That was their guild outing. They went on the dredger up the Clyde, and I think when they were on the dredger, they got fish and chips or something like that.
Oh
So
God, so not a
that was
bit
a
smelly.
guild day out. No, they loved it. They used to go every year, and I always remember when I was young thinking, why would you do that? And I think, to be honest, my house is probably on lime kilns that you were talking about, because that's right beside where we are. So it's really interesting when you hear all the different places and you think, oh, I've been there, I know that, I've seen somebody from there. One of my cousins is a Mormon, and they're very into genealogy, and so she has done the family tree for us. And when my mum died 2 or 3 years ago now, any paperwork that was in the house for our family, I gave to my cousin, because I knew that she would keep it all and she would be
Yes.
interested in all the kind of like that. I think there was a piece of paper for a layer for family way back and things. So I just do find it absolutely great to hear, and so interesting. And the way you present it is just it is fascinating, right enough. And so I would just like to thank you on behalf of the club for your talk tonight, and just for coming along and using the names of the people that are here, which is really great. So can I just thank George in the usual manner? We just give him a virtual round of applause and a round of applause.